And a very good morning to everyone. Thank you. I am so delighted to be a part of this very important conversation on how different faiths can build social cohesion and particularly resilience, a big issue for our time and day, against very divisive and at times even extremist kinds of narratives within our communities, and looking at how we can therefore widen and broaden resilience, if you will, beyond our own faith traditions, and seeing how they may impact positively our societies at large. On a very personal note, I am currently based in the United States. I live in the US, and it's been very disconcerting, I have to admit, at how divisive and extremist and fractious American society has become, and it's defined and driven oftentimes by very extremist conversations and narratives and behaviors as well that are social and political and religious in nature. And of course, here in the Southeast Asian region, we have our own issues and challenges as well. So what can we do about it? What has been done in our own faith traditions, number one, to begin with, as well as in an interfaith setting? How have we collaborated and cooperated to deal with these kinds of challenges? What has worked and what has not? What more can we do? What more needs to be done? I think these are some of the very important considerations that our two very, very important guests will help us to navigate. So we have these two excellent, very impressive guides to help us think through some of these questions. To my far left is Master Benjamin Tan of the Singapore Taoist Federation, and he is not just a prominent religious leader, but as I've also discovered in our conversations, a very, very and highly successful business person as well. To my immediate left is Dr. Dicky Sofjan, and he is a respected scholar, as we heard earlier from Chen Li, a scholar of religion at Gadjah Mada University in Indonesia, as well as a very prominent interfaith leader. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Their CVs are included in the conference program, so I won't say too much about it. But without much further ado, I just want to invite Pak Sofian to kick us off the conversation. So will you just join me in welcoming Dr. Sofian? Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace be upon you all. Distinguished guests, participants, and friends, I'd just like to thank you for inviting me, the organizers. This is my second time to speak in ICRS. Yes, the last time was 2019, where I was a moderator and speaker. So I thought, maybe I've done something right last time. So I was re-invited again. Anyways, my name is Dicky Sofjan. I'm from the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies. It's sort of an NGO come study program in Gadjah Mada University in the graduate school. But the consortium comprises of the Gadjah Mada University, which is the largest public university with 68,000 students and 2,500 professors and lecturers. And we offer an international and interdisciplinary, interreligious PhD program on interreligious studies. We have produce around maybe 56 PhDs from all over the world. So we've got students from the United States of America, from India, Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar, Philippines, Colombia, including Singapore and others. Yeah. So we're very proud of our program. So some of these things that I'll be talking about really sort of sets the ground for the things that I've been involved in terms of research, in terms of community engagement, and also my public speaking in various international platforms. So the structure of my presentation will talk more about the context and background of my thinking, and also, you know, some of the observations, direct observations, and you know, just sort of research as well on some of the things that I've found out about religion and religious communities, and perhaps later on provide some potential solutions, because I know that this is an international audience, so I'm sure that you know, we can exchange notes on a number of things. So first of all, this is just a quick sort of a reminder to everyone about the context and the background of things. So, you know, when you talk about resilience or sustainability, I would say that religion is perhaps the most resilient and sustainable institutions that the humankind has ever known, I mean, throughout history. Yeah? And looking at the sort of big data for the past years or past decades, you will see that there is some stability in the data sets in terms of people's affiliation to various religions and faiths and beliefs. Catherine Marshall, in the first plenary session, mentioned, you know, 84% of people having that religious affiliation. And if you look at the Gallup poll data, for instance, I mean, the data has been pretty much consistent, yeah, over the years since the 1970s. And that is to say, like, around maybe 85 to 90% of people on Earth still believe in what is called God and or a universal spirit. Yeah? So the data is showing some consistency on that. In terms of religious demography, this is the sort of big picture of things. Of course, this needs to be understood in a much more nuanced manner. We know that Christianity is also divided between the Catholics, the Protestants, and the Eastern Orthodox and other denominations. Yeah? And in the case of Indonesia, for instance, Catholicism and Protestantism are two different religions. Yeah? They have two different directorate generals within the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And even one could argue that Muslims are divided between the Sunnis and the Shias and the other schools of thoughts and sects. Yeah? And then the Hindus, it's interesting that the Hindus, perhaps 100, 200 years ago, was the majority religion in the world. And then there is the curious category of the unaffiliated, which really comprises of many categories there, which includes atheism, agnosticism, and also people who just don't feel, you know, they have a particular religion in mind, but they know that they have some faith and some belief in something. Now, if you look at regionally, you would find that Asia-Pacific is the most religiously diverse region of the world, yeah? And this is also based on what's called the Religious Diversity Index, where Asia-Pacific is 9.2 in the scoring level of the Religious Diversity Index. And this is one data which maybe not many people realize, you know, because when people think about Islam and Muslims, they think of the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa. But most Muslims live in Asia-Pacific. In fact, the Muslims who are living in Asia-Pacific are 3 times more than the people living in the Middle East and North Africa. And then in terms of religious growth, it is said that Islam is the fastest growing religion. Yeah, and this is why, by the prediction of the Pew survey research, in the future of religions, you would see that the Muslims would ultimately bypass the Christians by 2070 because of the growth of the religion. Essentially by 3 factors. One is high birth rates among Muslims, and you can see the same thing here in Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, and also immigration and conversion. Now, in terms of my own observations, I mean, I've been working in ICRS for over 12 years, but my research from my bachelor's degree, master's, and PhD have always been focusing on Islam or Muslim societies in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, especially Iran. And one of the things we realize is that, there is this sense of religious people having this monopoly over absolute truth, that they feel like they, control the absolute truth. And it's really hard to talk to some people of faith who truly believe in this, and that they feel like, that there is no other possible rightness of the religious others, right? And that they would not even perhaps change the terminology of truth with a capital T to truth with a lowercase, or even truths with an S. Secondly, I'm seeing increasingly this issue of dictatorship of authenticity, that religious people and communities tend to think that their traditions are sufficient. And because of that, they feel like they don't need to learn from the others. And I think this is a tragedy for many religious communities. I think we need to open up. I think we need to, I think it's fine to say that, our religious tradition is sufficient, that it would bring us salvation in this world and the hereafter, but I think we need to sort of try to open our minds and hearts to a much larger truth, perhaps. Why does God create this diversity? In the Quran, there's this beautiful phrase, وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً, meaning to say that if God had intended the humankind to be, just one race or one people, that would be easy for him. But then, this is a conditional phrase found in the Quran, which means that is not what God had intended in the first place. So to me, religious diversity is not only a social fact, but it's also part of divine will and plan of Allah. Thirdly, I'm seeing a fragmentation of religious authority and community. I think one of the reasons for this is also the rise of the internet age and social media, where there's just so much polarization, and that you are increasingly getting these so-called celebrity preachers, who take on the stage and tell people about their religion without having any sufficient sort of knowledge and experience in religion and in managing religious communities. We have this notion, and I've written about this some time ago in Indonesia, about dakwah-tainment. This amalgamation between religious propagation, da'wah, and entertainment industry. So this idea about tuntunan and tontonan. Yeah? So tuntunan being spiritual guidance and advice, and tontonan being visual entertainment. So we're seeing that phenomenon as well. And then if you look deep into the religious education, or religion subjects in schools, from kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, high school, and tertiary education, we're seeing a lot of problems there. Much of the teaching has been mostly focusing on the usual sort of rituals and worships and obedience and all. I myself experienced some portions of my primary school in Indonesia, in Jakarta, and all I learned was, firstly, the Taharah, this principle of purification of the mind and body before you do the salat, and then the zakat, and then the hajj, the umrah, and so on. So it's all about rituals. So there's not much sort of a deep sort of conversation or education about Islamic history, about the social justice, about the corruption, in perhaps even during the Islamic Empire, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So much of the education and curriculum is geared towards rituals and worship. Lastly, I'm seeing increasingly this lack of respect and appreciation and celebration of religious diversity. Again, I think part of that is due to the polarizing effects of the social media and the echo chamber effect and others, but also increasingly this sort of process of dehumanization, yeah, of the religious others. Yeah? And we're also seeing what we're seeing in sort of the offline reality going onto the online realities. Now, potential solutions. I've been involved in, at least for 3 or 4 years now, on a very huge program which I established with the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Indonesia, which is religious literacy for the promotion of religious harmony, multiculturalism, and social justice. And we focused on training religious extension officers who, I'm sure you don't know, numbers around 115,000 across the country, across the archipelago. And these are religious extension officers under the Ministry of Religious Affairs who are supposedly people who are obligated to or responsible to teach the right kind of religions to the masses. I can talk more about that later on in the question and answers if you're interested. But the idea of religious literacy is not studying, learning, teaching religion, but it's really learning about religion and studying about religion, about the phenomena that surrounds religion and religious communities, and how religious communities deal with the complexities of the social, political, cultural, economic circumstances. And then I think we need to, again, look at the educational system and reform. I wrote an article on the failure of the Indonesian educational system, which has brought anti-intellectualism into society, and also this political religious conservatism, which I think is quite crucial right now. And I think Indonesia is not alone when we are facing this problem. And then I think we need to also shift from our own sort of religious teachings and going into further, the area of human dignity. I just came back from Oxford University, where I co-hosted this workshop on human dignity in religious traditions, and trying to find the sort of teachings and doctrines and practices and histories about human dignity and how it's applied in religion and religious communities. I know that there's much more emphasis for the past maybe 50 to 70 years on human rights, but as far as the religious communities are concerned, I think human dignity to them is much more salient. And then also, when it comes to dignity, we need to also consider the dignity of others, meaning nature, the environment, and other species. There is this increasing sort of school of thought in the multi-species perspective on dignity. Yeah? So I think we need to also look at that. I'm currently building this program on eco-pesantren, which is trying to look at the conservation efforts and teachings and curriculum on ecological conservation in pesantrens, in the Islamic traditional boarding schools in Indonesia. So we're looking at 50 pesantrens in Java and Sumatra. And then I think this might not be so popular, a suggestion, which is to regulate the social media. I mean, there's a lot of, I should say, deficiencies in the way we regulate the social media. I understand the complexity in terms of trying to draw the fine line between free speech and, freedom of thought, and also the right to criticize religion, so to speak. Yeah? But I think we need to come together, both the state and society, to come together in terms of how we could make social media and the internet to be more beneficial for society for the sake of social cohesion. And lastly, I think we need to work harder in terms of pushing this agenda for freedom of religion or belief. There'll be a conference between the 7th and the 9th of November in Bali on Southeast Asian freedom of religion or belief. I think I will be there. I went to the one in Colombo in Sri Lanka and also Bangkok, and so this is perhaps the third workshop on Southeast Asian freedom of religion or belief. I have another slide, but I think I can sort of defer that later on during the question and answers. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so very much, Pak Sofian. Some very, very helpful thoughts and useful thoughts as well. Friends, let's invite Master Benjamin Tan to come and share some thoughts with us. Benjamin, come.
Good morning, distinguished delegates of ICCS. Today I'm going to speak about the resilience and cohesion regional perspective from the point of view of a Taoist. And first, I want to say that we are very lucky to be living in this very diverse community. And this is not something that is easy to come by. And then in Singapore, our only natural resources, our best resources, is our citizens. And then we cannot afford to have them segregated. Then that's why the government and the communities and these ground-up initiatives are putting a lot of effort into bring everybody together. And this is very vital in the Singapore society. So we can see Singapore emerges as a new business hub. Singapore ranked top city, maritime city, second busiest container port, world largest bunkering, Singapore Changi Airport, 8-year reign, world best airport. This year, I think we lost it. So all these amazing feats in this tiny little dot, this is almost impossible to achieve with our size. But yeah, we actually got all these amazing feats. So, but all this doesn't come easy. This was what we've been through. The December 11, 1950 Maria Hertog riots, the communal riots of 1964 and 1969, referring to two separate series of race riot involving clashes between the Malay and the Chinese. And also, in the recent times, Singaporean jailed for giving money to Malaysian men to join Islamic State in Syria. And 20-year-old, a youth, detained under the ISA after planning to attack the Jews in a synagogue in Waterloo Street. And a 16-year-old, a teenager, knowing how to plan terrorist attack on 2 mosques in Singapore. And 29 years old Singaporean man has been detained under the ISA after he became self-radicalized. A lot of this happened due to digitalization. There's pro and cons to digitalization. The pro meaning we can actually reach out to what we cannot reach out to easily through the digital web. And the cons, learning the things that are wrong through these platforms that we also easily reach out to. And what are the initiatives that has been done to put these youth closer together? So last year during the Catholic 200 SG forum, there was more than hundreds of youth coming together from different faith, different ground-up initiative, coming together in a dialogue. And then next you can see the Taoist Federation holding the Harmony Dinner. So Taoist Federation, where I'm from, we actually hosted a 1,000-table dinner, and 200 tables were given to guests from other faiths, bringing everybody closer together, being more inclusive and cohesive in the society. And also you see the last Zoom photo, this was taken 2 years ago. So you see, it's very difficult to actually see faith leaders of 10 different religions coming together in a Zoom meeting or even in a dinner setting. So this is what we have achieved, and this is what we have done to promote social cohesion in Singapore. And a little bit about the Ground Up Initiative. So Roses of Peace are youth-driven. They plan to promote interfaith message of peace, love, and harmony. Hash Peace, we got Fahima over there. Youth-led advocacy, developing programs that contribute towards the sustainable social harmony. IRO Youth Wing. IRO has a long history. Youth Wing. Youth coming from 10 different religions. And the IRCC is a platform to promote the racial and religious harmony in Singapore, in every constituency. So meaning every community that we lived in. And the Interfaith Youth Circle, ground initiative aimed at planting seeds that foster discourse around faith and belief. So you see the common thing between this organization is they are all youth-led. The youth nowadays, they want to be more vocal, and they don't want things to be swept under the carpet. because they actually foresee that if by sweeping things under the carpet, we won't solve things, and then things might snowball and become a bigger impact or become a bigger damage when it actually exploded. So yeah, these are the ground-up initiative that is happening in Singapore. And they actually also reach out to the regional organization that serve the same purpose as well. So a little bit about Taoism. Taoism is a Chinese religion and a philosophical tradition. And then to date, it has been 4,719 years. So the history of Taoism stretches throughout the Chinese history, and already originating in the prehistoric China, and has exerted a powerful influence over the Chinese culture throughout the ages. And Taoism has always evolved in response to the changing times, the doctrines and the practice always revising and refining. And currently, Taoist community is trying to adapt our belief to profound changes taking place in the society at the time where religious affairs easily ignite controversies. So, Tao the way, what is Tao? The philosophers believe that everything can only be understood by comparing its opposite, and day is only day in relation to night. Cold is in relation to heat, and soft only in relation to hard. And looking deeper, what has this got to do with the community? They realize that all these relationships are in a constant state of flux. Days flow gradually into night and back again. And this actually tells us, let us understand the meaning of our life and about our place in the world. So these concepts are the cornerstone of the Taoist philosophy. So compassion, everywhere we hear compassion. Across board, all religion, we speak about compassion. And even those without a faith or those without a belief, we talk about compassion. Compassion is an ability to willingness to empathize with the suffering of others. And when we see living beings suffering, we are naturally motivated to help them. We will not actually judge them. We will not help them based on their race, religion. When we see someone old and frail holding big bags in our community, we actually step forward and do you need my help? And that is a very touching scene. But this is actually losing its touch in our local community, whereby people only care about themselves and about what they're holding on their hands, which is the digital cell phone. And in Tao Te Ching, the chapter 49, Tao Te Ching is written by the founder of philosophical Taoism, Lao Tzu, in the 6th century BC. And it offers a profound wisdom, arguing that humankind is by a tiny part of an inexhaustible greatness, and that individuals can attain true fulfillment by striving to live in harmony not only with others, but also with our natural community. And when we realize that we are of the same substances as all things, our sense of identity naturally begins to expand to include all beings, which is why the sages teaches us not to be dogmatic or close-minded, and that fixed ideas that can never change wouldn't help in any situation. Next, humility. Such an approach enables us to stay light out of lines of fire, which can help us reach our full potential without being cut short by misfortune. And then in this context, we're actually talking about helping people. You don't have to always be in front to help people. You can actually help people from the back. So that's why we got the front people and the back end people. And these people are all very equally important. and that there shouldn't be competition within the team and also within the community or anything like that. And so this is this verse actually teaches us to view everything as equal and to treat everything in this world as the same. So a conclusion, I'll read from the conclusion. Tao equips its practitioner with tools by which to live their lives. The core of Taoism is to reject hatred and intolerance of human differences and live with balance, harmony, perspective, and compassion. While violence is not precluded in Taoism, it is a last resort. By increasing self-awareness and reducing influence of ego, which is often at the heart of conflict, Taoism promotes peace within and without. Many studies have emphasized that without peace among religions, there could be no peace and harmony among nations and communities. Therefore, it is important for all religious personages to achieve a consensus by following the teachings of their founders and the classics of their religion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both Dicky and Benjamin, for your very, very valuable reflections. We want to spend some time with Q&A. So let me just kick off our time with a couple of thoughts. We may remember back on day number 1, the special presentation that Lily Kong and Margaret, Catherine Marshall were a part of. And Lily Kong made the observation that by and large, our religious narratives are still very much being defined by primarily conversion. I think that's what she said, conversion and not so much convergence. And as Dicky earlier commented as well, you know, the continued monopoly of absolutes is something that I think privileges, therefore, conversion and less so convergence. So if that being the case, let me pose two thoughts, two related questions, if I could. First of all, what in your minds, Dicky and Benjamin, might convergence therefore look like? And we may recall also in her presentation, Catherine Marshall mentioned something about what she called covenantal pluralism, which I think suggests a shared or mutual commitment by different faith communities to, at the most very basic level, I imagine, to a kind of agree to peaceably disagree, or, you know, a live and let live approach, if you will, right? At the most basic fundamental level. Or are we talking about something a bit more ambitious, perhaps? A kind of fusion of the horizons, if you will, you know, of our different faith traditions. So which, in your view, might our existing efforts, the efforts that you have both referred to as well, you know, solutions and so on and so forth, what might they look like? What might the prospects, if you will, for a kind of fusion or convergence of horizons look like? Which leads then to a second consideration, for me at least. If Lily Kong were correct to suggest that we're still stuck in conversion mode, if you will, and not convergence, as far as our narratives and conduct are concerned, then let me pose this question. Is social cohesion and resilience, therefore, threatened presumably by conversion per se, or is it more accurately the extremist forms of conversion narrative and action that are posing the problem? Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm as concerned as any of us here in this room are with regards to divisive discourse and divisive conduct. But if the expectation here is the minimization, or if you will, even the total interdiction or elimination of religious conversion altogether from our social interactions, then I think surely that doesn't make sense to me. And if indeed that were the case, if conversion is still very much a part of the the dialogue and conversation that is before us, then our faith leaders, our faith communities doing all we can to ensure that the sharing of our convictions is done in as winsome, in as respectful, and as peaceful a way as possible, to which both you gentlemen have also alluded to. So let me just throw these ideas out before us, and feel free to pick up on anything that you may so wish. But perhaps we could begin with this before we move on to questions and comments from the floor. So gentlemen, any of you want to wish to begin in response?
Thank you, Dr. Tan. It's a very difficult question. One, I think before we talk about religious conversion, I mean, we need to, I guess, think or rethink about and redefine what religion is and is not. You see, I think when we talk about religion, people have different ideas about religion, right? I mean, some people say that religion is this so-called ultimate concern, right? And this sort of preoccupation for the ultimate concern. But then others have said that, religion is really a way of life. It's a methodology in life, in how you resolve your problems or the problems of your communities, right? So depending on how you define religion, then you can speak of religious conversion, right? Because to me, I mean, from my own sort of perspective and my own ideas about Islam, and I know this is unoriginal, I would say, but to us, the idea of religion is sort of quite foreign, because the closest terminology of religion in the Quran is deen, right? So deenullah. So it's really about how we approach God and how we can be near God. And some would argue how to become one with God. Right? But this idea about Islam being a way of life is quite important, I think, because one, almost all of the main concepts and operational concepts in Islam refers to a way or a street or a road, like Sharia, like Tariqah, and all. I mean, they are all referring to some sort of a way towards something higher, perhaps, a way towards the ultimate concern. So, to me, conversion is still an issue. I mean, if you look at it objectively, I mean, there are many people who convert either into Islam or out of Islam, and some states make it a problem for conversion, especially in places like Malaysia, if you were to convert out of Islam, for instance, right, where you need to go through the rehabilitation center and whatnot. But in many places, conversion is part of this freedom of religion or belief, right, that the freedom to convert into a religion and out of religion. And that is also consistent with the principles in Islam. I think the Imam from Queensland had earlier alluded to the principle in Islam, la ikraha fid din, that there should be no compulsion in the matters of faith, right? So compulsion and faith are two contradictory categories, and I don't think that forced conversion is anything good, obviously. But if people were to convert out of goodwill because they had done their research, then of course this is justifiable. And we are seeing this everywhere. And as I mentioned, Islam right now is, according to the Future of Religion research by Pew, is the fastest growing religion. And one of the reasons for that, as I mentioned, was conversion, right? And, I've been to Japan and worked for the Nippon Foundation for about 4 or 5 years. Went to Japan 8 times. And the first time I went to Japan, I was this visiting fellow at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto. And just across the road, there is the Islamic Cultural Center in Kyoto. And so I arrived on a Wednesday, and I went to the Friday prayers on the Friday. And right after the Friday prayers, there was an announcement saying that, there are our brothers and sisters who will be converting to Islam. So apparently there were 7, men and women of Japanese citizens who converted to Islam. And that was my 3rd day in Japan only. And so we are seeing this kind of process of conversion everywhere. And I think, again, if we were to look at religion as being a way to find the ultimate concern, then that is perfectly justifiable. If you look at the data in the US, for instance, and I'm sure you know this, right? Like, you know, there is, 12% of African Americans, but yet, you know, the prison population is populated by, 50% African Americans, right? And most, or many, I should say, of the African Americans who are in jail convert to Islam. And the question was why? Because they thought that it provided liberty to them, right? The same way the Japanese women who are marrying Pakistani second-hand car dealers in Tokyo, for instance, right? Because they feel that there is liberation from the patriarchal sort of male-dominated society in Japan. So these, we need to look at religious conversion from the contextual you know, the circumstances that surrounds this process of conversion. And speaking of context, I think this is quite important in terms of how we look at religion and how people and religious communities look at religion. I mean, I live in the northern part of Yogyakarta, which is on the way to the Mount Merapi, the famous Mount Merapi, which is perhaps the most active volcano in the world. And so next to my house is this rice field, and next to it is this large river where the you know, cold lava, if the Merapi were to erupt, would pass by, you know, 19% of the cold lava. But then everywhere it's green. It's, you know, with plants and trees and so on, and water flows there, you know, from the spring about maybe 2 kilometers away. And I have low-hanging fruits in my, you know, I have a durian tree, and I have so on. And if you look at the Quran, for instance, the Quran always talks about al-Jannah, you know, talks about paradise as being tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, where the rivers, you know, below flow. And I'm thinking, you know, I'm living here in Sleman, and I have rivers flowing, you know, below me, and I have low-hanging fruits. You know, this needs to be contextualized. I mean, I think if you were an Arab living in the middle of the desert, you would appreciate that kind of paradise. But if you were living in my place, that paradise would not be so appealing, right? So contextualization of religion, to me, is an imperative, and there's no other way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dicky. That's very helpful. Benjamin, any reflections on your part?
So, from the clergy point of view, what we can actually, in our local circle, more and more daring dialogues led by the youth, like I have mentioned, has been arranged and organized, and then religions are also diving into topics like that. So we, in order to ensure that the country is inclusive and cohesive, the embracing and the acceptance of different groups of people living in this island country will allow them to gain a sense of security and belonging, so as to live and work better here. So the part that religion really can play here is only to participate more when opportunity rises. Because in our East Asian community, and what people actually know about religion is only the motion of praying. That's actually how it sparks my curiosity into the religion, and later on to the interfaith sin. Because many of our family, East Asian family, when we actually see our elderlies praying, and when we actually ask them, hey, why are you guys doing this? They actually tell you, keep quiet, just follow what we do. Don't ask so much. So many a times, things like this happen, and many values get lost on its way, even practices, culture, heritage. So people just know the motion of praying. Oh, I'm praying for the sake of seeking blessings, for the betterment of myself. And that's all they know. That's why a lot of these religious good values, it just get lost on its way, and people actually lost their way while trying to search for what is inside the religion. And this has led to a lot of people being led astray and causing a lot of societal problems and things like that. So it is quite vital from the clergy point of view.
Thank you, Benjamin. That's really useful. We want to have a round of questions and comments from the floor. There are roving microphones, so if you could put your hands up, please introduce yourselves briefly, and let's try to keep the question or comments brief so that we can include as many people as possible. So, yeah, this lady in the front, please. Is there a microphone that we could?
Hello, hi, morning. My name is Fui. I come from Malaysia. I have a question for Dr. Sofian. As I said, I come from Malaysia, and we have a religious department under the Prime Minister's office that has been allocated a huge sums, well, usually get huge sums of annual budget. Last year was 1.5 billion ringgit, and that's something like 40% of our defense budget. That's being allocated to this department called JAKIM. And I'm just reading that there are 70,000 mosques in Malaysia, and this 1.5 billion is actually for allocations for mosques, including imams, bilals, and kafah teachers. So from a non-Muslim viewpoint, for us, looking at from the outside, it looked more like an enforcement agency. So I'm just kind of interested when you say that there are 150,000 religious officers. Is that right in Indonesia? Is it 150,000 or 15,000?
115,000.
115,000. And they're responsible for teaching Islam in Indonesia. Are you able to just explain their role?
All religions, he said.
All religions. I see. Okay. Thank you. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, so it's more of a comment and not so much observation and not so much a question?
More an well, I mean, it would be good if Dr. Sofian could maybe explain their role a little bit more. Are they focused on religious teachings, or is it on religious literacy?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I have also been researching on Malaysia. I did my API fellowship at ICMAS in UKM as well. And it is true that there's a sort of a stark difference between how Indonesians and Malaysians see religion and its place in state and society. But may we remind ourselves that Malaysia oftentimes sees itself as an Islamic state, right? And I think this has been sort of regurgitated by many of the, prime ministers and so on. Even the last years during the Mahathir 1.0, and it was a long 1.0 term, where he ultimately said that, we are all fundamentalists, right? That we are already an Islamic state. Right? Whereas in Indonesia, of course, our country is based on the state ideology of Pancasila, where we recognize other religions, in addition to Islam, of course. Although one might critically say that the first principle of Pancasila has more sort of likings for monotheistic religions as opposed to the more sort of non-theistic or non-monotheistic religions, right? But that could be argued later on if you're interested, because the idea of Tuhan and ketuhanan means two different things. Yes, JAKIM has been playing a major role in terms of trying to Islamicize the Malaysian society, but yet it's not only JAKIM, but also the major political parties of UMNO and PAS, obviously, which oftentimes they have, for many decades been, in competition and trying to out-Islamicize the other, right, saying that we are more Islamic than you, and so on and so forth. So I think there is that sort of very different ways in which we see society and what we envision as an ideal community. If you look at the sort of history of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina, for instance, he did not establish an Islamic state, right? But he established a multicultural society there, where there was mutual respect, mutual acceptance, and a celebration of diversity. In fact, this idea about lakum dinukum waliyadin, that unto you your religion and unto me mine, I think also tells us what the true and authentic teaching of Islam is when they see diversity as a fact of life. And as I mentioned in the previous talk, right, that the Quran is very clear about religious diversity or even ethnic diversity or any forms of diversity as not only being a social fact or reality, but also part of divine will and plan of Allah.
Wonderful. There was a hand at the back, the last table at the end. Yes, ma'am. And then a gentleman in front. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Amina Rasul from the Philippines, and I've been trying to ask this question since the conference started. We're all looking at how faiths can bridge the divide, and I really wanted to get a clearer idea of how our faith leaders and our faiths can take us away from the brink. Because if you look at what has been going on in the last 2-3 decades, leaders of faith-based organizations have actually been supporting very authoritarian leaders under the guise, for instance, in the United States, there's talk of Christian nationalism. And how do you move us away from the precipice? Because what worries me is there's a continuous march towards the precipice, and it's possible to see the demise of democratic rules reaching us in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Big question. Gentlemen, who would like to start?
In the scriptures that teaches us how to live our life as a Taoist, there was actually one of the tenets. So telling the Taoists that if you live in the place, follow the rules of the place. And it is believed that between different faith leaders, as we sit down in a round table, 10 faith, 20 faith, we put aside our discipline and our teachings, not to the extent of putting away everything, but when we are there to make peace, or even there with a focus or duty on interfaith, we tend to put aside what actually restrict us from doing so. So there might be some faith or belief that actually tells people that our faith is superior, and then we should always be on top. So these are some of the things that the religious leader in Singapore, that's how they actually achieve the interfaith while sitting in a round table together. That's why when I was showing the this slide, there was one slide whereby there was a gala dinner, and this was an amazing feat that was achieved by the Singapore faith leader and admired by people from all over the world. It is almost impossible. We can put it this way, it's almost impossible in some parts of the world for faith leaders even to sit face to face without having a dinner or to have a conversation. So, like I've mentioned it is very important for the religious personages to actually follow the teachings and because in some scriptures that some of us might have, we are supposed to separate the religion away from this social stuff and things like that. So, yep. So I think following the original text and classics is very vital for the religious people. Yep.
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Ibu Aminah Rasul. I would just like to say that the idea of religious literacy, again, is not about studying religion or learning religion, but learning about religion, right? So how religion interacts with society, with economics, with politics, culture, and international relations, and whatnot. So the idea is, how do we get people to move away from the more sort of normative teachings of religion to a more sort of objective ways of looking at religion? Because if you are able to combine these two thinking, I think you'll get a much more sort of comprehensive understanding about the super complex reality of religion itself, society, and what God had intended, God's divine will and plan itself. Within the, I think, Muslim intellectuals, there has been this sort of transition from a preoccupation of towards the Sharia to what's called the Maqasid al-Sharia, right? So rather than looking at the religious laws or divine ordained guidance from God, they look at the principles and the core objectives of the Sharia itself, right? So looking at issues of, for instance, maslahah, common good, common interest, looking at adalah, the concept of social justice, for instance, and how to incorporate rahmah, how to incorporate mercy into our religious systems, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So there is some movement toward that end. And I think in many religions, we are also seeing that. In Catholicism, we've got this what is it? The public theology and the social. What is it called again? The social something. Catholic social teachings. Sorry, the CST, right? And others. And so we are looking at different ways in which religious communities are trying to sort of grapple with the super complex reality of the world that we live in now. And I think this is why I think religious leaders, especially those coming from the more sort of traditional and theological schools, that they need to be exposed to other sort of sciences and disciplines. And this is where I think ICRS comes from, comes in terms of looking at education, because we are, after all, teaching the teachers. So many of our students are actually imams and ustads and pastors and ministers from various religious communities. And by infusing some of these social scientific perspectives and humanities perspective, that, they tend to sort of open up to the other truths in life. And I think, to me, I mean, I've seen this happening, individually to some of the students that I have been teaching from different traditions, and it seems that they have come out of the program, feeling much more sort of comfortable in terms of how they comprehend reality.
Thank you. And it seems to me it's important as well for us to do all we can to preserve and to protect that third space, right? That third public space for civil discourse, especially those religions that are being privileged by political nationalists, and we need to do our part to keep that space open and as inclusive as possible. The gentleman, yes, thank you for your patience, and then the gentleman over here as well. Sir, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Dicky. I am Munawar Liza from Banda Aceh. I want to ask you about the Gerakan Islam Nusantara in Indonesia. What is that movement? And secondly, what is your opinion on the implementation of Sharia law in province of Aceh in Indonesia? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. These are not so much difficult questions, but very sensitive questions. Well, for one, my own understanding of Islam Nusantara is that it is an attempt to articulate this idea about the indigenization of Islam, yeah, or pribumisasi Islam, as Gus Dur or President Abdul Rahman Wahid used to say, right? So it's merely an attempt by the Indonesians to come to terms with how do you fuse religion and culture or local wisdom, right? So I think Indonesians have been grappling with this issue since time immemorial, I think, since the arrival of Islam, I would say, right? Because I think, as we all know, that Islam came to the shores of Nusantara, to Southeast Asia, through merchants and through mystics, right? So there was definitely not, a religion of the sword, so to speak, which was spread in Nusantara. So, but what we know of the Nusantara, or most of the archipelagic region of Southeast Asia, was that there were already other religions. There were already indigenous beliefs that were, spread across the archipelago. And so the question is, how does Islam, which of course sees itself as a universal religion, come to terms with local indigenous religions or beliefs, right? So I think if you look at much of the discourse on Islam Nusantara right now, that it has been driven by the Nahdlatul Ulama, which has long been a champion of the indigenization of Islam, right? So there is that sort of idea that the negative influences of transnational Islam has really negatively affected the cohesion of the Indonesian Muslim community, right? So with the incursions of the movements and the ideologies of Hizb ut-Tahrir, for instance, and even Al-Qaeda and ISIS, ISIL, and whatnot, you are seeing a much stronger sort of stance on the part of the Nahdlatul Ulama and for the most of the traditional Muslim communities in Indonesia to go up against these so-called negative forces, right? Because there is also this sort of understanding that the Arabization of Islam has something to do with the radicalization of Islam as well in Nusantara. Right, this might be something which is very sensitive to talk about, but this is something, to me, is part of that deep and difficult conversation that we need to have if we were to have, or produce a cohesive society. So, and Buya Shafi'i Ma'arif, the late sort of, father of pluralism in Indonesia, had once said that this Arabization of Islam is really sort of a manifestation of what's called misguided Arabism, right? So this idea that to be a Muslim you need to be more Arabic, or to be a Muslim you need to be Arabicized, right? So I think this is one of the sort of discourses being played out. And we've seen this manifestation in Indonesia, in Singapore, in Malaysia, Brunei, Thailand, Philippines, and whatnot. So again, this is a mere sort of attempt to articulate the fusion between religion and culture. In terms of the Sharia, I'm also trained in political science, and so we believe that, people get the governments they deserve. Right? I mean, to put it bluntly, right? I mean, there was a referendum. There was, maybe not so much a referendum, but there was a convergence of ideas about how we can bring Aceh to the fold of Nusantara and Indonesia again, right? Of course, we know that the the comeback of Aceh into the Republic was also due to the tsunami. But then we also know that there is this high religious and Islamic sentiment in Aceh, which goes way back, right? In fact, I would argue, and I've argued this in my book on the history and the culture of Shias in Southeast Asia, that the first Shia kingdom was in Perlak, right? So, which is the first Islamic kingdom, basically, in Nusantara. So to think that the Islam in Nusantara is predominated by Sunni today is correct in the sense of the contemporary times, but in 1,000 years ago, it wasn't like that. Yeah? So the idea that the Islam being spread throughout Nusantara, throughout Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, and so on, is the strand of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah has to be also re-examined. Yeah? And if you also look at the different cultural practices, yeah, the Maulud, yeah, the Ashura, for instance, right? You have Asan Osen in Aceh, right? You have Tabui in West Sumatra, for instance. You have Tabat in Bengkulu, right? And all of them are remnants of the festivities to commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, for instance, right? So there's Sharia on the one hand, but then there is also the interpretation of Islam on the other, right? And oftentimes, these two don't jive well. I mean, they don't fit in well enough. I mean, what kind of Sharia will you be implementing, right? If you were to hold the Sharia law in Aceh, but why is Muhammadiyah, for instance, being sort of marginalized there and not being able to develop their schools and mosques in Aceh? So these are some of the questions that we need to ask. And I think there needs to be much more consideration and discussion and discourse about the maqasid al-Sharia and how we could sort of looked and examined the idea about the principal objectives of the Sharia rather than the Sharia itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentleman over here up front, could we have a microphone?
Thank you very much. My name is Gurmukh Singh. I come from Malaysia. I represent the Sikh National Youth Organization of Malaysia, although I don't look very youthful with my white beard. Thank you very much, Saudara Sofian and Master Tan for your very interesting input and sharing the experience in your respective countries, predominantly. I was blown away when I heard Tuan Sofian share about the 116,000 plus religious extension officers propagating harmony and propagating understanding. I wish this sort of movement comes to Malaysia as well. But just to, and my sister Ui from Malaysia shared a little bit about government spending for JAKIM and things like that. But I think that is because Malaysia is an, well, I won't say it's an Islamic state, or I don't think there's any propagation towards is making it an Islamic state as such. There is a lot of religious tolerance in Malaysia, and I think we are very grateful for that. Now, where all these measures that were shared by both you gentlemen, I have two questions. I'll come right to it. Where the various measures which are prevalent in both countries, in Indonesia and Singapore, are concerned, it is possible to have these measures such as interreligious dialogue, education, governmental initiatives. It is because of the type of quality, the leadership that you have in your respective countries. Singapore, for example, will have no room for religious intolerance at all because it cannot afford to. It's such a tiny state. So we cannot have any sort of extremism or fundamentalism. And Indonesia, I think, with the able leadership of President Jokowi, I think it is because of the type of leadership that you have that you are able to implement these. Taking your experience, we probably can moot for similar things in Malaysia as well. But are you, and I don't mean to get too sensitive about anything, but are you prepared to concede that where fundamentalist governments are concerned, then there's little room for progress? I mean, we can progress in our respective countries maybe because we have a nice mixture of various religions and already religious tolerance in place. But in certain regions where there is fundamentalism, this helps very little. If that is true, if it helps very little, then to achieve religious tolerance on a global scale is still a tall ask. I put it to you. My first question. My second question is mainly for Master Tan. We have a similarity. I'm wearing a turban, it appears so are you. Of course, mine is a little bit more colorful than yours is. What is the significance of the headgear? It's a beautiful headgear. What is the significance in Taoism of the turban that you are wearing? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question. This time, the question is easy, but the answer is difficult. One of the problems with the program on the religious extension officers, and as I mentioned, we have 115,000 religious extension officers across the archipelago, and 5,000 of them are civil servants, and the rest are what we call state honorary employees who get very meager salaries from the state under the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And for your information, the Indonesian Ministry of Religious Affairs is perhaps the maybe third or fourth biggest public institution in Indonesia, receiving the third or fourth. I mean, if you include the police, then it becomes the fourth state agency to receive the national state budget. But one of the problems with the religious extension officers is that Indonesia sees itself as responsible and obligated only to provide provision to and subsidy to the 6 religions, right? Whereas the other religions, you know, based on the law number 1 PNPS 1965, that they will be left alone, so to speak, right? Left alone being that they will be able to expand and grow as they wish they could, but the government will not provide subsidy, any form of subsidy to these groups. So what happens is that most, if not all, of the religious extension officers only represent the mainstream groups, right? So usually it's the usual suspects in the city or in the district, right? So people, if they're Muslims, and they would most likely be people or representatives from the Nahdlatul Ulama or from the Muhammadiyah or Nahdlatul Watan and so on and so forth, the mainstream Muslim groups. Similar with the Catholics, the Christians, Hindus, and Buddhists. And so what we're finding is that there are these more sort of preferred religious communities and the non-preferred religious communities, right? Because we have many religious communities. We have a lot of developing and growing religious communities, like the Baha'is, for instance, right? But they're never invited to become religious extension officers, right? Because the government sees itself as not having the responsibility and obligation to provide any provisions for them. And similarly, you know, small sects like the Jehovah's Witness, for instance. We've seen the Christian groups trying to lobby the Director General for Christian Affairs, for instance, to ban Jehovah's Witness, right? But our stance has always been that, you know, the government should not be in the business of banning any religious communities. Unlike in Malaysia, for instance, you've banned the Shia since, 1983 and 1984, right? We've only had recommendations by the Indonesian Council of Ulama to be vigilant about the Shias, but not a wholesale sort of banning of Shia Islam, for instance. And I think the Ahmadis similarly, right? In fact, there is only at the level of ministerial decrees that there have been this statement by some ministers to sort of limit the activities of the Ahmadi communities in Indonesia. So you are correct that different leaders bring different visions of the state and visions of society, and I think it also comes down to how they see themselves religiously and how they are socialized, how they're educated, for instance. I mean, President Jokowi, the current president, has a very strong sort of Nahdlatul Ulama, traditionalist Islam background, and hence he has that sort of soft spot for the Nahdlatul Ulama and traditionalist form of Islam. In the case of Malaysia, you do have activities relating to religious harmony, but most of the time the Muslims are excluded from this, right? Because Islam is sort of the primus inter pares, right? The first among equals of all religions there, right? Because Islam has and do have special position in the Malaysian Federation. So in terms of the leaders themselves, I think much of the leadership that we see have been oftentimes pressured by their own constituents. We have just recently, I think maybe 1 week ago or 2 weeks ago, we had the mayor of Bandung officiating a new building by ANAS. ANAS is this national organization that is anti-Shia. And the mayor of Bandung has just officiated the building over there. And so now we are getting a lot of civil society organizations and religious communities, and including the Minister of Religious Affairs himself, telling off the mayor to say that you should not be promoting intolerance in society. So again, you are correct in saying that religious harmony and cohesion lies a lot in leadership.
Thank you. Benjamin?
So, to the question about the Taoist headscarf. So, most of the headscarf that we wear is actually black in color. And the black color in Taoism actually corresponds to the sky, the heaven. And also in the 5 element, it actually corresponds to the water. And water is a supreme good in Taoism, actually. And so one of the texts written about water in Taoism in chapter 8 of the Tao Te Ching. The supreme good is like water. It nourishes all things without trying to compete with it. And then it also flows to low places that is loved by everybody. So this is why it is black in color. Yep.
Having your head in heaven, that's a good place to be. The lady at the back, way at the back. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hanadi Dola, and I am from the Interfaith Center of New York. So I'm coming to you all the way from New York City. And this is for all 3 of you, and I would love to wait for all of you to weigh in on this. How do you recommend doing successful interfaith work with respect to the laws of your country? I'm from New York, and the laws that apply to me are obviously not the same that apply to people here. And it is very common for us to have those very difficult faith-based conversations without any fear of governmental repercussions. How can we really expect faith leaders to bridge the divide if they are hindered by certain state laws that silence their identities, voices, and beliefs? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to begin?
I think in the case of Indonesia, the problem of intolerance is not so much coming from the state. Yeah? So much of the intolerance and the intolerant attitude is coming from masses. Yeah? So we call mobs. And then the second one originates from some of the fatwas and edicts from the Indonesian Council of Ulama. In Indonesia in 2005, they in fact came up with this fatwa or ruling against syphilis, what we call syphilis, which has a certain resonance to some disease of a sort. Right? So it's this fatwa against secularization, pluralism, and liberalism. And if you look at the studies by Setara Institute, the Abdurrahman Wahid Institute, and so on, you would see that it's not actually the state that is the main propagator of intolerance, but rather the mobs and also some religious groups, intolerant and radical groups. And then you also have in there the Indonesian Council of Ulama. Yeah? And the way I see this is that, again, I think some Muslims are still sort of preoccupied with this idea about the Sharia, right? And much more than how they would see the maqasid al-Sharia, the principal objective of the Sharia, which obviously, again, is social justice, right? And the common good of the people. And I think we can easily find this in our long tradition. In fact, the idea of maqasid al-Sharia had been around since perhaps the 11th century and 12th century by Imam Shatibi and Imam Ghazali, right? This idea about hifzun nafs, for instance. I mean, that is the main and first principle of maqasid al-Sharia, which is the protection of lives. It's not the protection of religion. Religion comes like maybe third or fourth or even fifth. Right? But the first and foremost principle of maqasid al-Sharia is the protection of lives and then the protection of property or mal, your money, your house, your property, and so on and so forth. And then comes the protection of religion, right? So we have that in our, intellectual thinking. But that is not coming to the fore for some reason. And I understand, within the context of this conservative turn that we're experiencing, I think we are moving away from this idea about the principal objectives of the Sharia as opposed to, promoting the Sharia itself.
Thank you. Benjamin, you want to jump? No. Okay. All right. So we have our part to play in reminding our communities with regards to the teachings and the laws and what have you. Let's have the gentleman in the black jacket sitting up here. Microphone, please. Thanks. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Singapore. Okay, my name is Thiru. I am from the Racial and Religious Harmony Circle. I work with the community at the grassroots level. Okay, my interest is, actually, I evolved in a Hindu cultured family for generations, and I'm a born Hindu. Okay, what I'd like to see, recently I have been meeting people with alien names that does not identify where they come from or the language they speak. Was quite interested, so I went to India and visited some places. And I went to first a Christian compound. And those people who are living around the Christian compound, they had names that are alien to them or to the language. All of them were carrying English names. James, Sebastian, Stanley, Thomas. They got none of the Indian names. Okay, then I went to the Muslim community and around the compound I met. And I met them totally alien names, again, Arabic names. They will have no identity. If they were to go to USA or UK or Australia, if they go and introduce themselves, Sebastian will be looking at them. Or they will go to Europe or Middle East, they're going to say, tell them their name is Khalid, okay, Aman, or whatever it is. They are not going to recognize them as Arabian. So what is my interest is now, I noticed that our religion and our faith, for example, I'm a Hindu. I'm very proud of it because there is no conversion for us. Neither do we stop anyone from converting to any other religion. Because Hindu religion, we believe one thing, that our faith is inborn within us. So it's our practice, our culture, our tradition, and our beliefs. So in that case, I notice some of the religions are competing with each other they are actually deviating from fundamentals. They are bringing in their, what we call attractive or have a commercial value, and they're franchising it. Today I see more visibility of them branding themselves, being the favorite. So the branding is actually a new term in this new commercial world, in this IT information world. So it's becoming branding. So why are we branding the religion? Are we deviating from the fundamentals of practice, of beliefs that will bring more commonality among people and bridge gaps? So what is your comment, sir? Thank you.
Any of you wish to respond to that? I think it's more of an observation and comment than a question.
I think I'll comment on your last statement. You know, one of the things that we need to understand about religion is that religion sells. Yeah? Islam sells. Yeah? If you talk about Islam, if you connect religiosity, religion, and products, it goes well perfectly. If you go to Indonesia right now, if you go to many of the department stores right now, and you buy a refrigerator, and you'll see a halal certification from the Indonesian Council of Ulama. I mean, why would you need a halal refrigerator? I mean, it's not like the Muslims are going to eat the refrigerator, right, or anything, right? But I tell you, you go to any department store that sells refrigerators in Indonesia, and you will see a halal certification from MUI. I said, this is ludicrous. I mean, where does it say in the Quran or in the Hadith and prophetic Hadith and teachings of Islam that, you know, we can't, well, obviously we can't eat refrigerators, but then that refrigerators need a halal certification, right? But again, we need to go back to this idea about commodification of religion, right? And I mentioned earlier about my research on da'watainment and the commodification of religion and the involvement of celebrity ustaz and ustazas. And it sells well. And I can tell you one by one, each of these celebrity preachers have their own sort of products that they are selling. Right? Previously, for instance, Yusuf Mansur, he was selling Fatigon Spirit and Telkomsel. And then the late Jeffrey, for instance, Ustaz Jeffrey, who died from a motorcycle accident, he was actually endorsing a product for the motorcycle helmet, which is ironic, right? Mama Dede, for instance, a very famous celebrity ustazah who's been on television for the past, 15 years now. And she has been endorsing this Kaki Tiga product, which is a sort of a herbal drink that many Indonesians take, you know, to refresh your body and so on and so forth. So religion sells, right? And Islam sells marvelously. And I think you can find the same kind of tradition in the US since the early 20th century with the televangelism and the, you know, the health and wealth gospels to television. I think it has also been around for many years in the Philippines as well. Yeah, but commenting on Hinduism in Indonesia, I've been working with the Hindu University in Bali for almost 4 years now. So I'll be going there next month as well. So we hold international conferences twice a year, and then we have an international journal on interreligious and intercultural studies twice in a year, and we have what's called the Bali International Writing School, which is to help build the capacity of the Hindu academics in Indonesia because they seem to be lagging behind. But one of the things that is happening in Bali is also this concern about the transnational Hindu movements, most notably Hindutva, Hare Krishna, and Sai Baba. They see that the incursions of these transnational movements are causing problems for their local identity as a Hindu Balinese. And so I'm currently now doing research together with the Hindu academics there to unpack this idea about sampradaya. I don't know whether that's a Hindi word or I'm sure it's based on Sanskrit word, but it's sampradaya, which means something like, you know, religious sects of movements. Right, sir? Right? Yes. Right. So we are trying to describe how that is happening right now in Bali, and with the incursions of these transnational religious movements. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to draw this session to a close because we're already a few minutes beyond the clock. So, but your enthusiasm for this session, I think, has been very obvious just by the number of hands and comments and observations. So thank you so very much. Will you please join me in thanking Dr. Sofian and Master Tan? Appreciate it so much. Thank you.